Found out yesterday, Caroline, good morning, there was an independent autopsy the family of this 18-year-old had issued or conducted. They made sure that it happened. The results came out yesterday, but it's still inconclusive. What did you make of what it didn't say?
Yeah, so we still have an inconclusive cause of death and an inconclusive manner of death, which is frustrating, right? Because it seems like we have more more questions than we have answers. Yeah. We do have potentially different questions, I think. Really important to note that yes, this was an independent autopsy performed by a very well-respected forensic pathologist. However, it was the second autopsy performed on Nolan's body, right? So the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed expeditiously their autopsy. We just don't know the results of that yet because they're crossing all their T's, dotting all their I's, waiting for the toxicology report to come back. We just have the benefit of getting these results more quickly. I would like to just set expectations for that. A second autopsy, you're never going to get as much information from a second autopsy as you do from a first autopsy, right? There were inherent limitations here, not the least of which was body decomposition, right? So they noted that the body had been pretty severely decomposed by the time they were able to look at it, such that they couldn't find potential bruising on surface level areas. The first pathologist retained the neck structures of Nolan Wells' body, which
and why would that
So it's not uncommon. So when you're looking at a potential drowning death, the neck is an important region of the body to see, including those pathways, whether there was water, things of that nature. So, I don't want to I have to stress it's not atypical. Even the forensic pathologist that conducted this report noted that that is a typical course of action. But the fact is, when you don't have the full body, you cannot come up with a cause of death or a manner of death.
And you're focusing on something being typical procedure because there's so much attention on this incident. It's heartbreaking, and there's suspicion about if this young man was helped by his friends or if his so-called friends had something to do with his death. This independent autopsy could not rule out foul play, and I understand the results will eventually be handed to a grand jury. So what does this all really mean as far as getting to the truth?
Well, it certainly doesn't rule out foul play, but I think there are a subset of causes of death that we can rule out, right? There was no blunt force trauma to the head, for example, with lacerations, meaning no gunshot wounds, no knife wounds, indicating perhaps a physical altercation prior to the entry of the water. That being said, there's no way to rule out other potential homicidal causes of death. Look, you have an inherent tension in these types of cases where you have the grieving parents here that lost a beautiful boy. They want answers and they want them now. But the integrity of the investigation really needs to, hinges on waiting until till you have all of the information there in order to come out with answers. And I think that's what we're seeing here, this tension.
Yeah, a heartbroken community, but a general public transfixed by this case as well. Caroline Polisi, thanks for breaking down what we know.
Nolan Wells' Autopsy Furor as FBI swoops in. July 19th, 2026. A conference room in a hotel ballroom. 3 states away from a barrier island most Americans had never heard of 2 weeks earlier. A parent stands at a podium she never asked to stand at, holding a printed report she never wanted to read, in front of a room full of cameras she never wanted pointed at her family. Behind her, a lawyer begins reading a document out loud, line by line, phrase by phrase, a document written in the flattest, most careful language profession can produce. Words like focal area of red discoloration. Words like undetermined pending investigation. Words built on purpose to promise nothing and rule out nothing. The room is full. Reporters with credentials clipped to their jackets, community advocates standing along the back wall, a row of cameras on tripods pointed at a podium crowded with microphones. Somewhere in the audience, a mother sits beside the father of the young man this entire room is here for, both of them having already done the hardest thing a parent can do, plan a funeral for their own child, and now doing something almost as hard, sitting through a public reading of exactly what was and wasn't found inside his body. And somewhere in that reading, one sentence lands differently than the rest. The anterior neck structures, the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the hyoid bone, were not received with the body. Nobody in that room is a forensic pathologist. Most of the people watching at home aren't either. But you don't need a medical degree to feel the temperature of a room shift when a mother's attorney says, out loud, that part of her son's throat wasn't there when the second doctor opened him up.
An independent autopsy is sparking more questions than answers.
This news is as important as any news finding out why is Nolan Wells dead.
On how an 18-year-old football star vanished and was later found dead during a 4th of July boating trip with friends.
He's saying based on the examination of the body, he cannot rule out foul play.
Here are Nolan Wells' preliminary autopsy results and the questions that still remain unanswered. The preliminary results of an independent autopsy of 18-year-old Nolan Wells have been shared with the public after famed civil rights attorney Ben Crump and Wells' heartbroken parents, Christine and Elmore Wansley, flew their son's body over 800 miles to Washington, D.C. for an independent opinion on Wells' untimely death. An autopsy on Wells' body was initially performed by the Jackson County coroner, but the results have not been released. According to NBC News, the coroner's office is waiting for the medical examiner to complete a toxicology report on the teen before releasing the findings. Crump claims that the investigation into the teen's death is full of, quote, contradictions.
The hope is that when this is presented to the grand jury, all relevant witnesses and evidence will be presented to them so that we can have a fair and impartial investigation into the death of Nolan Wells.
According to authorities, Wells and a group of friends took a boat out to Horn Island, a popular spot about 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, to celebrate the 4th. Though it isn't clear what exactly transpired on the island, authorities said Wells was last seen around 3 p.m. talking to a girl at the north end of the island. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter told ABC News that Wells' friends eventually left the island to go back home without him, telling the outlet that Wells supposedly chose to stay on the Oasis. But as it got dark and there was no sign of Wells, the 18-year-old's mother called to report him missing at around midnight, according to WLOX. A U.S. Park Service ranger recovered Wells' body off the northwestern tip of the island 2 days later. In a press conference at the annual NAACP National Convention in Chicago on July 22nd, Crump revealed that an autopsy performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, president of the National Medical Association, found Wells' cause and manner of death as, quote, undetermined pending investigation, but that he, quote, cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells.
Even though it tells us significant information, we still have more questions than we have answers at this time.
In results presented to the standing room only audience, Crump read out Mitchell's preliminary report, which included several notable gaps. Wells' toxicology results were still pending when the preliminary report was released, and Mitchell also noted that Wells' anterior internal neck structures were removed during the teen's initial autopsy, which meant Mitchell couldn't rule out an injury to his neck as a contributing factor. Wells' stomach and other organs were also removed in the first autopsy by the Jackson County coroner, which meant the pathologist couldn't examine the teen's stomach contents. But something at the back of Wells' head was noteworthy enough for Mitchell to highlight in his report. Although Wells' body had no fractures or deep tissue injuries, a 12 by 8 inch section of red discoloration was identified in the deep soft tissues on the back of his head. The report noted that the discoloration could be an indication of head trauma. However, because of the body's extensive decomposition and lack of associated injuries, such as skin lacerations or skull fractures, the board-certified pathologist wrote that that interpretation was also inconclusive. On top of Wells' missing body parts, the doctor also highlighted several more unanswered questions in his autopsy report, including what circumstances led up to Wells entering the water, what position was the body in when found, and was there any water in the airway, which would indicate drowning. Crump claimed that Wells' body was found face down and fully clothed despite photos from the day showing him shirtless, wearing swimming trunks. Police have said nothing points to foul play, at least yet, and they suspect Wells likely drowned after his friends left the island without him. With so many unanswered questions still swirling, NAACP President Derek Johnson took a jab at police and local officials for spreading a narrative that Wells's death was an accident.
The narrative should not be it was an accident before there was an investigation. The narrative should not be the words of individuals who went on a boat to the island with him, but they came without him, but with his cell phone, and you don't investigate those individuals. Without accusing anyone of anything other than the state of Mississippi and local officials, we're accusing them of being derelict in their duties.
This is the moment the Nolan Wells case stopped being a story about a missing teenager and a tragic drowning and became something else. A story about two autopsies that don't agree on how much they don't know. A story about a federal agency quietly stepping into a county sheriff's investigation. And a story about a family that has now spent 3 weeks doing something almost nobody should ever have to do twice. Burying their son and then fighting, report by report, phone call by phone call, just to find out how he died. This is the update, and there's a lot in it. So let's take it slow, because every piece of this matters, and getting it right matters more than getting out fast. Over the last 3 weeks, this case has moved through almost every stage a story like this can move through. It started as a missing person report on a holiday weekend. It became a recovery operation. It became a sheriff's office issuing a one-line statement that would haunt the rest of this investigation. It became a family's decision to hire an attorney, and then a second forensic pathologist, and then a national civil rights organization. It became a grand jury referral, a joint phone examination, a federal agency quietly lending its resources to a county sheriff department. And somewhere along that timeline, it also became something uglier, a flashpoint for viral misinformation, for competing narratives, for anonymous commentators building entire theories out of a photograph nobody had bothered to date, and a voice nobody had bothered to confirm. We're going to walk through every one of those stages tonight, in order with a source attached to every claim. Not because a story this serious needs padding, it doesn't. But because a story this serious deserves to be told completely, with nothing skipped past for the sake of getting to the shocking part faster. If you're the kind of viewer who wants the full picture instead of the fastest headline, stay with us. This is going to take a while, and it's going to be worth it. I'm going to tell you exactly what has been confirmed, exactly what remains a claim, and exactly where the two are still colliding. Because if you followed this story anywhere else online over the last few weeks, you already know how badly those two categories have been getting mixed together. And a family that has already buried an 18-year-old son does not need the internet inventing a version of him or a version of that day. That isn't true. So before we go back to Horn Island, before we go back to the boats and the beach and the last confirmed hours of Nolan Wells' life, I want to make you one promise of this entire video. Every claim in this script that comes from a witness, a family member, an attorney, or an anonymous source will be labeled as exactly that, a claim. Every fact that comes from an official report, a sheriff's statement, a coroner's finding, or a court filing will be labeled as confirmed. If we don't know something, I'm going to tell you we don't know it. Instead of filling that silence with a theory dressed up as certainty. That's the deal.
Thank you. Well, more than 2 weeks after an 18-year-old college football player was found dead along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, his family still doesn't know how he died.
A new autopsy report released today offered only pieces of information. Bradley Blackburn has the latest on the death of Nolan Wells.
Cause of death undetermined, pending investigation.
A preliminary independent autopsy report commissioned by Nolan Wells' family still has them searching for answers.
The only question that we have is what happened to our son.
The 18-year-old was last seen on July 4th, partying with friends off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. This video, obtained by TMZ, shows the back of a man who many believe is Wells. His friends have told authorities he stayed behind to be with a girl. His body was discovered 2 days later. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump said the report shows there was red discoloration on the back of Wells' head, but the reason is unknown.
Somebody saw something. Somebody knows something. There were almost 300, 400 people. Somebody knows something.
Authorities have said there's been no indication of foul play, but the death of a black teen and lack of answers in the investigation concerns black leaders. Reverend Al Sharpton, former NFL star Terrell Owens, and movie producer Tyler Perry have contributed to a reward for information.
Reporting indicates that he was found face down, fully clothed. They're just trying to piece together before the time of death what happened leading up to that, and every piece of evidence like a video or testimony from friends will be part of putting that narrative together.
The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office will not release its autopsy report until toxicology tests are completed. Bradley Blackburn, CBS News, New York.
Well, in the family's autopsy report, the pathologist said he did not have access to all of the remains, including parts of the neck and throat. He said it is common practice for the first autopsy to retain certain parts of the body.
Now, let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand who Nolan Wells was before any of this happened to him. Not just a name on a police report, not just the center of a media storm, but a kid who, 3 weeks ago, was getting ready to go back to football training. Ocean Springs, Mississippi sits on the Gulf Coast, a town built around church parking lots. High school football under the lights on Friday nights, and a coastline that has raised generations of kids who grew up on boats before they grew up on bicycles. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He graduated from Ocean Springs High School that spring, and by the summer, he was already enrolled at Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he was set to play wide receiver. Friends and family described him, consistently, using almost the exact same words. Big-hearted, funny, the kind of person people were instantly drawn to when he walked into a room. His father would later describe him as the wittiest one in the family, the one who never met a stranger, someone whose aura pulled people toward him without him trying. He was also, by every account, deeply attached to his phone the way most 18-year-olds are, not out of vanity, but because that phone was where he kept a record of his own life. He was constantly taking pictures and videos, constantly documenting gatherings, constantly asking his mother to snap one more photo before he went to bed. That detail is going to matter later in this video. So hold on to it now. Nolan Wells was, by his own family's account, a kid who never went anywhere without his phone in hand and never let a day pass without putting something on Snapchat. Football wasn't just a hobby for Nolan. It was, by his father Elmore's account, a language the two of them shared. Elmore has described getting texts after practice with 3 or 4 video clips attached. Nolan running a route, making a block, wanting to know what his father thought of the play. And by his father's account, he always got an honest answer, not a soft one. Elmore has said publicly that he made a point of telling Nolan the truth about his game, win or lose, because he believed that was the job of a parent, not to tell a kid what he wanted to hear, but what he needed to hear to actually get better. That relationship between an 18-year-old chasing a football future and a father who took the coaching seriously is part of what makes the timing of all of this so hard to sit with. Nolan should, by every reasonable expectation of what his life looked like 3 weeks ago, be back at training camp right now. His mother, Christine, works as a healthcare provider, a family nurse practitioner, according to public reporting. A detail she has referenced publicly more than once, almost as if to remind people that grief doesn't exempt her from the work she still has to show up for every day. She has described Nolan as the wittiest person in the family, the one who could walk into a room and pull people toward him without trying. She has also said, in the plainest terms a parent can use, that he never met a stranger, and that even the people who started out as something like a rival would, given enough time, end up becoming one of his friends instead. Ocean Springs is not a large town, and in a community that size, a kid like Nolan tend to be known well beyond his own household. Teachers who had him in class have talked about how much they liked him. Teammates, past and present, have spoken about him. Coaches from both his high school days and his brief time at Southwest Mississippi Community College have been reported to be part of the extended network of people the family reached out to as they began planning his services. This wasn't a young man who existed only within a tight circle of friends. He existed inside an entire town's memory of who he was, which is part of why, when this case became a national story almost overnight, so many people who had never met Nolan personally still felt like they had lost someone they knew There's a particular kind of grief that shows up in the language people use about someone who died young, and it's worth naming here because it recurs throughout every account given by Nolan's family and friends. Nobody describes him in the past tense easily. His father slips, more than once in public interviews, into describing what Nolan would be doing right now, at practice, sending game film, arguing good-naturedly about a play call, before catching himself and returning to what actually happened. That's not a rhetorical device. That's what losing a child that suddenly does to the people left behind. The future you'd already built in your head doesn't disappear just because the person belonged to did. His mother has described a version of grief she's living through as something closer to a wound with no edges, one that doesn't behave the way people expect grief to behave, with clear stages and a foreseeable end point. Some hours, she said, she can talk about him easily, tell stories, laugh at the memory of him bursting into a room. Other hours, without warning, it becomes unbearable, physical, an actual weight she's described sitting on her chest. Both of those are true for her at once, sometimes within the same conversation. That's not unusual for a parent in her position. It is, however, something worth remembering every time this case gets reduced online to a debate about a GPS timestamp or a discoloration measurement. Underneath every one of those details is a family living through exactly that kind of grief, in public, on a timeline they never chose. It's worth sitting with that context for a moment before we move forward into the timeline of July 4th, because everything that follows in this video, the GPS data, the autopsy findings, the missing neck structures, the joint phone examination, is going to get clinical and technical and at times genuinely hard to follow. That's the nature of an active investigation, but none of it exists in a vacuum. Every piece of forensic terminology we're about to walk through describes something that happened to a specific 18-year-old who, 3 weeks ago, was looking forward to a holiday weekend with his friends. The night before Independence Day weekend, his mother, Christine Wansley, made the family salmon for dinner. Nolan hugged her, told her he loved her, and left to spend the night with friends ahead of the holiday. It was, by every account we have, an entirely ordinary goodbye, the kind neither of them had any reason to remember. It would be the last time she saw him. On July 4th, Nolan traveled out to Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, reachable only by private boat, with no buildings, no services, nothing but sand and water, and that day, hundreds of holiday boaters spread out across its shoreline. He went with a large group of friends. Not the small handful of people early photos suggested, but a group large enough that they split across 3 separate boats to make the trip out. He was last seen, by the accounts of friends who were with him, sometime around 3 o'clock that afternoon, on the island's northwest tip, in blue swim trunks, without a shirt. He never came home. To understand how a large group of people could spend an entire day within sight of each other on the same stretch of coastline and still end up with a genuine gap in the timeline, it helps to understand what Horn Island actually is. It is a federally protected barrier island, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, and accessible only by private watercraft. On any ordinary weekend, it draws a modest crowd. On the 4th of July, by multiple accounts from people who were there that day, it draws thousands, boats anchored in long rows along the shoreline, groups spread out across a stretch of sand and dune grass that runs for miles, music carrying across the water, coolers, grills, fireworks, and particular chaos of a holiday crowd that has been drinking since late morning. One of Nolan's acquaintances who was part of the larger group that day, Warren Hudson, has since given a public interview describing the scale of what going to Horn Island actually meant that weekend. According to Hudson, the group heading out that morning wasn't a handful of friends in one boat. It was large enough that they split across 3 separate vessels, following each other out to the island and tying the boats together once they arrived, the way people who know each other well and go out together often do. Hudson has estimated the total number of people on the island that day in the thousands, describing rows of anchored boats stretching for what looked like miles. However large that number actually was, it underscores something important about this case from the very start. Whatever happened to Nolan Wells that afternoon did not happen in isolation. It happened somewhere within sight of an enormous number of other people, which is exactly why investigators have spent the last 3 weeks asking repeatedly and publicly for anyone who was there that day to come forward with photos, video, or first-hand accounts. Here is what is confirmed from GPS data obtained by news outlets from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources and from official statements by the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. The boat carrying part of the friend group left its original dock at approximately 9:56 that morning and arrived at Horn Island at 11:14. Nolan was last seen by his friends around 3 p.m. sometime after that. The boat's bilge pump failed, and the group made the decision to head back to the mainland early. NBC News later obtained audio, through a public records request, of what appears to be a call for help that day. Voices reporting the boat was taking on water, confirming everyone aboard was accounted for. According to friends' account, given to reporters and, they say, to investigators, Nolan chose to stay behind. He'd met a young woman that day. Her name has since become public as Katie, and the group says he told them he planned to catch a later ride back to the mainland. GPS records show the boat left Horn Island at 4:31 p.m., returned to the original dock, then made an additional trip to a place called Fort Bayou before returning to the dock again. And finally, that evening, the boat was towed by trailer back to its owner's residence in Biloxi. Nolan's phone did not go with him. It stayed behind on the boat on the dash, along with, according to one friend's account to ABC News, roughly 15 other phones that had been left there the same way, a common practice among the group to keep devices away from saltwater spray. Sometime around 11 p.m. that night, one of Nolan's friends contacted the Coast Guard. Christine Wansley reported her son missing to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office that same night. Using the Life 360 location sharing app, Nolan's mother located his phone at a friend's house on the mainland. When she arrived, she says the group was inside, sitting with the lights off, watching television. When she asked where Nolan was, she says it took approximately 15 minutes for someone to retrieve the phone from a truck outside. A search involving the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and the volunteer search and rescue organization United Cajun Navy began the following day and continued for 2 days. Brian Trasher, Vice President of the United Cajun Navy, has publicly described the search from the air. Hours spent canvassing a large stretch of coastline before law enforcement boats were spotted converging on the island's northwestern tip. When the search team descended to get a closer look, they saw personnel gathered on the beach and, through a zoom lens, a body at the shoreline that matched Nolan's description. On the morning of July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found Nolan's body in the water off the island's northwestern tip, the same stretch of shoreline where he'd last been seen alive. According to Trasher's account, the body was found face down at the water's edge, wearing only the blue swim trunks Nolan had been photographed in 2 days earlier. No shirt, no shoes. That detail matters, because early public commentary, including a statement attributed to attorney Ben Crump describing Nolan as having been found fully clothed, created a brief and significant point of confusion in this case. Trasher has since stated publicly on the record that this description did not originate from his organization, and that Nolan was found wearing swim trunks alone, consistent with how he'd been dressed hours earlier and consistent with the missing person description circulated at the time. That distinction has since been clarified across multiple outlets, and it's worth including here specifically because it's the kind of small factual correction that matters enormously to how the rest of this case gets interpreted. He was identified not through a visual identification by family, but through dental records, a detail that, on its own, tells you something about the condition his body was in after 2 full days of Gulf Coast heat and saltwater exposure. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter's office released an early public statement indicating there was, at that point, no evidence to suggest a crime had occurred. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn stated there were no immediately visible signs of physical injury. That statement, no foul play suspected, arrived less than an hour after the body was recovered, before toxicology results existed, before a full autopsy had been completed, and before investigators had, by their own later admission, formally interviewed several of the people who were with Nolan that day. It is that early statement, more than almost anything else in this case, that set the tone for everything that followed. Before we go further into what the second autopsy actually found, and I promise you it's a lot. If you're new here, this is True Crime Killers, and we cover cases like this one the same way every time. Slowly, carefully, and without pretending we know things we don't. Our subscriber count is actually lagging pretty far behind how many of you are watching these videos, which tells us a lot of you are finding us but not sticking around. So if this kind of grounded, fact-first coverage is what you're looking for, hitting subscribe genuinely helps us keep doing it. Okay, back to Horn Island. Within days of Nolan's body being recovered, his parents retained prominent civil rights attorney Ben Crump. It's worth pausing here on why a family in this position brings an attorney of Crump's profile before any suspect, any charge, or any wrongdoing has even been alleged, because it's a step that's often misread by the public as an accusation in itself, when in practice it's closer to insurance. An attorney like Crump exists to pressure agencies toward transparency, to help coordinate a second, independent medical opinion, and to make sure a grieving family isn't navigating a state bureaucracy alone while they're also planning a funeral. That second opinion is exactly what came next. Nolan's body was flown to Washington, D.C., where board-certified forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell conducted an independent autopsy, funded, the family has said, in part by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. Dr. Mitchell is not a fringe figure brought in to manufacture a conclusion. He spent 7 years as chief medical examiner for the District of Columbia, later served as chief medical officer and pathology chair at Howard University Hospital, and currently serves as president of the National Medical Association. Whatever his findings, they carry the weight of 2 decades handling exactly this kind of case. Meanwhile, the state of Mississippi had already performed its own autopsy the day after Nolan's body was recovered. Those results, as of this recording, are still not public. Officials say they're waiting on toxicology testing, a process that can take weeks regardless of how much public attention a case receives. 2 separate medical examinations, 2 separate jurisdictions, both stalled at the exact moment national attention on this case was at its peak. On July 15th, Nolan's parents met face-to-face with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath for the first time since their son's body had been recovered, more than a week after his death was confirmed. Following that meeting, Ben Crump announced 2 developments that would shape everything that came after. First, once the sheriff's office completes its investigation, the case will be turned over to a grand jury. It's important to say clearly what that does and does not mean. A grand jury referral is standard procedure in Jackson County for any unnatural or suspicious death. It is not, on its own, an accusation, and the district attorney's office has stated directly that this is not currently being treated as a confirmed criminal investigation. What it does mean is that a panel of citizens will eventually review the evidence and decide whether it supports a criminal indictment. That is a meaningfully more serious step than an investigation quietly run in the background, but it is not a verdict and it is not a charge. Second, Nolan's phone, the device his mother tracked down and retrieved from his friend's house that first night, would undergo what Crump called a mutual inspection. Both the family's own digital forensics experts and law enforcement's experts would examine the device's contents at the exact same time, seeing the exact same data pulled the exact same way. Legal analysts who've spoken publicly about this case describe that kind of joint examination as highly unusual. It typically doesn't happen unless there's already a significant breakdown of trust between a family and the agency investigating their child's death. That breakdown of trust is, in its own way, one of the most important threads in this entire case. Christine Wansley told reporters in the more than 2 weeks since her son's death was confirmed, the only direct contact she'd had from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department was a single text message, one she sent herself, asking for an update more than a week after the body was found. Under Mississippi law, victims' families are entitled to receive an incident report within 72 hours of a death. As of the family's July 15 press conference, more than 2 weeks past that legal deadline, they still had not received it. Whatever else this case turns out to be, an accident, as officials initially suggested, or something requiring a different kind of accountability. That gap in communication is not in dispute. It is documented on the record by multiple named sources, including the sheriff's own office. Before we move into the forensic details of the second autopsy, it's worth pausing on something that tends to get lost in a case that moves as fast. This family had to plan a funeral in the middle of all of it. On July 20th, Nolan was laid to rest at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with visitation beginning at 9 in the morning and the service following immediately after. Filmmaker Tyler Perry covered the full cost of the funeral. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated at the family's request. Afterward, the family held what Christine Wansley specifically asked people to call a celebration of life at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, rather than traditional repast. Because, in her words, Nolan would not have wanted a room full of people sitting around crying in silence. He would have wanted a party. She made a point of opening that celebration to media, and anyone who had known Nolan through football, former teammates, coaches, classmates from both middle school and high school, people who played against him as well as with him. That decision is worth sitting with for a moment. A mother who, at the time, still did not have an official cause of death for her son chose to let cameras into his funeral rather than retreat entirely from public view. Whatever conclusions anyone wants to draw about this case, that is not the decision of someone trying to keep the world from looking. The family has also spoken candidly about the cost of all of this beyond the grief itself. Christine has described being publicly questioned about her parenting, her family's GoFundMe, and has said she has been called a racist for the way she has pursued answers about her son's death, despite working as a healthcare provider who, in her words, takes her job and the people she serves seriously. That detail matters because it's easy, from behind a screen, to forget that every family at the center of a case like this one is absorbing an enormous amount of public scrutiny in real time, on top of the loss itself. We're including this section not as a detour from the investigation, but because it's part of the same story. A family cannot fully grieve while also fighting for a police report they're legally entitled to receive within 72 hours and still don't have weeks later. Keep that tension in mind as we move into the next part of this video, because it explains a great deal about the tone of everything that has followed. It's worth spending a moment on the scale of the search effort itself, because it says something about how seriously this was treated from the very first hours, regardless of what the sheriff's office would go on to say publicly about foul play. Within hours of Christine Wansley's missing person report, multiple agencies were already coordinating a joint response. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the United States Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and the National Park Service, whose jurisdiction includes Horn Island as part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. The volunteer search and rescue organization United Cajun Navy, which has assisted in numerous high-profile search efforts across the Gulf Coast in recent years, joined the search as well, contributing aerial coverage that ultimately played a role in helping recover Nolan's body. This was not a quiet, under-resourced search. It involved boats, aircraft, and personnel canvassing miles of shoreline in open water across 2 full days, in the kind of oppressive Gulf Coast summer heat that makes every hour of search and rescue work considerably harder on the people doing it. Brian Trasher of the United Cajun Navy has described spending roughly 2 hours in the air before spotting the convergence of law enforcement vessels that ultimately led to the recovery. It's a detail worth including because it complicates any narrative that suggests this case was treated casually from the outset. The search itself was substantial, multi-agency, and sustained. What has drawn criticism from a family, from civil rights advocates, and from legal analysts who reviewed the public record isn't the search for Nolan while he was still missing. It's what came immediately after his body was found. A public statement ruling out foul play, issued within roughly an hour of recovery, before toxicology existed, before complete autopsy had been finalized, and before several key witnesses had reportedly been formally interviewed. That's the specific decision that set the tone for everything that followed, and it's worth separating clearly from the genuinely serious search effort that preceded it. On July 19th, standing beside Nolan's parents at a press conference hosted by the NAACP, attorney Ben Crump read Dr. Roger Mitchell's preliminary independent autopsy report aloud, in full, to the room. This is a document that has since driven nearly every headline in this case. So let's go through exactly what it says, and just as importantly, exactly what it does not say. The report is dated July 19th, 2026. The examination itself was performed on July 10th, several days after the state's own autopsy had already been completed. The classification for both cause and manner of death is listed as the same two words, repeated deliberately: undetermined, pending investigation. That phrase, undetermined, pending investigation, is not evasive language. In forensic pathology, it is a specific, honest classification a medical examiner uses when the evidence in front of them genuinely does not point clearly toward accident, homicide, suicide, or natural causes. It means exactly what it says. We don't know yet, and we're not going to pretend that we do. Dr. Mitchell's report notes that by the time he received Nolan's body, it had already undergone significant decomposition, and that the state's initial autopsy, performed appropriately and as standard practice, had already removed and dissected the internal organs. Because of that decomposition, the report states, it becomes much harder to visually identify bruising on the skin surface, which meant Dr. Mitchell performed a series of additional dissections not typically part of first autopsy. The face, the back of the head and neck, the ribs, the pelvis, the back, the buttocks, the arms and legs. This is worth noting, an unusually thorough examination, the kind of dissection more commonly associated with in-custody death investigations, where establishing the complete absence of trauma is considered just as important as finding its presence. The result of that extensive dissection: no fractures, no deep tissue injuries anywhere on Nolan's body, with one specific exception. During the dissection of the back of the head and neck, Dr. Mitchell's report identifies a focal area of red discoloration, measuring roughly 12 by 8 inches. In the deep soft tissue overlying the occipital bone, the bone at the base of the skull. The report is explicit that this finding could not have been observed during the first autopsy, because that kind of posterior head and neck dissection was not performed at that time. Here is where I want to slow down, because this is a single detail driving the most speculation online, and it deserves the most caution. The report itself states, in its own words, that the origin of this discoloration is unclear. There are no lacerations of the overlying skin. There are no fractures of the underlying skull. Dr. Mitchell's own conclusion is that the finding is inconclusive for a pre-death injury, due to both the extensive decomposition of the tissue and the absence of any associated wound. He states plainly that he is including it in the preliminary report specifically because it warrants further investigation, not because it proves anything on its own. We reached out to independent forensic sources to understand what could plausibly cause a finding like this, and the honest answer is several things, none of them confirmed. Post-mortem lividity, the natural settling of blood after death, depending on how a body has been positioned and transported, can produce this kind of discoloration. So can decomposition itself, which breaks down muscle tissue in ways that can create reddish discoloration entirely unrelated to any injury. So, in theory, could blunt trauma. The report does not rule any of these in, and it does not rule any of them out. It states accurately that more information is needed. Let's slow down on this specific point, because it's the one detail from this entire report that has generated the most speculation, and it deserves to be explained properly rather than left as a scary phrase floating in a headline. Lividity, in forensic terms, is simply what happens to blood after the heart stops pumping it. Gravity takes over, and blood begins to pool in whatever part of the body is lowest of ground. If a person dies lying on their back, that discoloration typically settles along the back of the body, the shoulders, the buttocks, the back of the head, and neck. That process can continue, in a limited way, even after death, depending on how a body has since been moved, positioned, or transported. A body that was recovered from open water, transported to a coroner's office, autopsied, placed in a body bag, and then flown across the country for a second examination has been repositioned multiple times over multiple days. And each of those repositionings can influence how blood settles in the tissue, entirely independent of anything that happened to that person before they died. Decomposition adds another layer of complexity on top of that, As muscle tissue begins to break down after death, it can take on a reddish or purplish discoloration on its own, without any external trauma at all, a process forensic pathologists sometimes describe as marbling or diffuse tissue change. Dr. Mitchell's own report specifically notes that Nolan's body had undergone marked decomposition by the time of the second examination, and that this decomposition, on its own, can make it significantly harder to distinguish between a genuine injury and a natural post-mortem change. This is exactly why the report does not use the word hemorrhage. It uses the phrase reddened area. That word choice is deliberate, and it matters. A hemorrhage implies bleeding caused by an injury. A reddened area is a more neutral, more cautious description, one that leaves open every possible explanation, rather than committing to one. Dr. Mitchell's report is, in that sense, doing exactly what a responsible second opinion should do, describing precisely what was observed, without overstating what it proves. There's been considerable public debate about the body's position when it was recovered, because that position matters for evaluating this kind of finding. According to a representative of the United Cajun Navy, who assisted in the search from the air, Nolan's body was found face down to shoreline, wearing only swim trunks. Whether that position is consistent with the specific pattern of discoloration described in the second autopsy is a question forensic experts disagree on, and one that cannot be resolved without additional information the second pathologist did not have access to, which brings us to the next major finding in the report. Dr. Mitchell's report states that when Nolan's body arrived in Washington, D.C. for the second autopsy, several internal structures of the neck, the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone, were not received along with the body. The report is careful and specific about what this does and does not mean. Dr. Mitchell states it is his assumption that the initial pathologist in Mississippi retained these structures for additional evaluation, and notes that retaining anterior neck structures after an initial autopsy is, in his professional experience, common forensic practice, something he says he did himself during his years as a medical examiner in cases where there was any concern about possible fracture or compression in that area. That's an important distinction, and one that got lost in a lot of the online commentary that followed this press conference. Dr. Mitchell is not alleging that evidence was hidden from him. He is stating that these structures are commonly retained specifically when a medical examiner wants to conduct further, more detailed evaluation of them, and that their absence from his own examination is a limitation he's disclosing, not an accusation he's making. What it does mean in practical terms is that Dr. Mitchell's posterior neck dissection was performed without being able to examine the corresponding structures at the front of the neck, the structures most directly relevant to identifying manual strangulation, ligature strangulation, or any compression injury to the airway. Because of that missing piece, his report states plainly that he cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributing factor or cause of death. Not that he found evidence of it, that he cannot rule it out because he didn't have access to the material that would let him. To understand why these particular structures matter so much, it helps to understand what forensic pathologists are actually looking for when they examine them. The hyoid bone is a small, delicate, U-shaped bone that sits high in the neck, unattached to any other bone in the body, held in place entirely by muscle and cartilage. Because of that unusual structure, it is rarely damaged by everyday injury. When it does fracture, it is most commonly the result of direct pressure applied to the throat, the kind of pressure associated with manual strangulation, or, less commonly, a ligature. Alongside the hyoid, examiners also look at the thyroid cartilage, the laryngeal structures, and the strap muscles that run along the front of the neck, checking each one for small fractures or internal hemorrhaging that would indicate the airway had been compressed at some point before death. None of that examination could be performed by the second pathologist because none of that material was available to him. That is the entire substance of this finding. It is not an allegation that something was found in those structures. It is an honest disclosure that those structures were never examined by the second doctor at all, which means the question of whether there's any indication of neck trauma remains, as of this recording, genuinely open, dependent on cooperation between the two medical examiners' offices that has not yet publicly been confirmed to have happened. There is one additional detail worth including here, because it's been widely discussed but rarely explained with any nuance. The second pathologist also did not have direct access to intact lung tissue, which is one of the more common ways forensic examiners assess whether someone drowned. The state's initial autopsy had already dissected the lungs, as is standard practice, and preserved tissue samples for the second doctor's own histological review, meaning Dr. Mitchell was working from sectioned tissue samples rather than the organs themselves. He has stated that he submitted his own samples for further microscopic examination, looking specifically for evidence consistent with drowning at a cellular level, a process that takes additional time and has not yet produced a conclusion. The report lists several additional limitations along the same lines. Because the lungs and stomach had already been dissected during the first autopsy, Dr. Mitchell was unable to directly examine them for water content or gastric material, information that would typically help determine whether someone drowned, and roughly how long it had been since they last ate. Toxicology results from the state's examination had not yet been received at the time this report was written and remain outstanding as of this recording. The report closes with a list of 7 specific outstanding questions Dr. Mitchell states must be answered before determination can be made. The circumstances that led to Nolan entering the water, his body's position when found, whether there was water in the airway, whether there's evidence of injury to the anterior neck structures, whether there's evidence of intracranial hemorrhaging, the composition of stomach contents, and the toxicology findings. And then, one final sentence, which is a sentence that has driven the most coverage of this case in the past week. For these reasons, this pathologist cannot rule out if any intervening non-accidental factors contributed to or caused the death of Nolan Wells. Let's be precise about what that sentence is and what it isn't. It is not a finding of homicide. It is not an accusation against any person. It is a formal, careful acknowledgement that based on the limited information available to this particular examination, an accidental drowning has not yet been definitively established as the cause of death, and that until the remaining questions are answered, other possibilities remain on the table. That is a genuinely significant development in this case. It is also specifically not proof of a crime. We're at the halfway point of this update, and there's still a lot of ground to cover. The FBI's involvement, the questions around the friend group's account, and where this case realistically goes from here. If a script like this one, that actually slows down to explain what a forensic finding does, and doesn't mean instead of just running with the scariest headline, is worth something to you, that's exactly the kind of channel we're trying to build here. We've noticed our view counts are climbing a lot faster than our subscriber numbers lately. So if you want to be here for the next update on this case the moment it drops, go ahead and subscribe now. It costs nothing, and it tells us we're doing this the right way. Let's keep going. Before we move past the autopsy findings and into the federal and legal side of this case, it's worth stepping back for a moment to talk about something bigger than this one investigation. Because the same pattern that's played out here plays out in nearly every high-profile case that moves as fast online, and knowing how to spot it will make you a sharper viewer of the story and everyone after it. The first thing worth watching for is the difference between a claim and a finding. A claim is something a witness has happened, something a family member believes based on what they've been told, or something an attorney repeats because a source brought it to them. A finding is something documented in an official report, confirmed through forensic testing, or stated on the record by an agency with the authority to make that determination. Both categories matter. Neither is automatically more true than the other, but they carry different weight, and treating a claim as if it were already a finding, the way so much of the early coverage of this case did with both the pool photo and the confrontation video, is exactly how a case like this one gets distorted before the facts have even had a chance to catch up. The second thing worth watching for is what we call a retraction gap, the space between how far a false claim travels and how far its correction travels. The pool photo theory reached hundreds of thousands of viewers within a single night. Its correction, when it finally came, reached a fraction of that audience days later, buried under new developments that had already moved the conversation elsewhere. That gap is not unique to this case. It's structural to how information moves online, and it means that responsible coverage has an obligation to actively resurface corrections, not just publish them once and move on. That's part of why we spend as much time on the retracted claims in this video as we have on the confirmed ones. Because leaving them out entirely would let the original, false version keep circulating unchallenged in people's memory of this case. The third thing worth watching for is language that sounds definitive, but is actually deliberately open-ended. Phrases like cannot rule out, undetermined pending investigation, and inconclusive are not evasive language designed to hide something. They are the specific, professional vocabulary forensic pathologists and investigators use when the evidence genuinely does not point clearly in one direction, and treating that careful, honest uncertainty as if it were a coded confirmation of foul play is, ironically, exactly the kind of overreach that responsible forensic reporting is supposed to guard against. And the fourth thing, maybe the most important one, every person named in a case like this one who has not been charged with crime is still, legally and morally, entitled to the presumption that they've done nothing wrong. That includes people whose behavior looks, from the outside, confusing or even suspicious. Teenagers who panic after a traumatic event don't always behave the way an outside observer expects a completely innocent person to behave. Sometimes they freeze. Sometimes they go quiet. Sometimes they make decisions under the pressure of shock that look strange in hindsight, but were never criminal to begin with. That possibility deserves exactly as much consideration as the alternative, until the evidence says otherwise. We're telling you all of this not to lecture you, but because we genuinely believe it makes you a better audience for a story like this one. One that can hold uncertainty without needing to resolve it prematurely, and one that can separate genuine concern for a missing piece of evidence from an accusation dressed up as a question. In the days following the release of the second autopsy report, Sheriff John Ledbetter confirmed publicly that his department has been in contact with the FBI since the investigation began. That confirmation, understandably, generated an enormous amount of speculation. And here, too, precision matters more than excitement. Horn Island sits within the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which is federal land. That alone gives the FBI a jurisdictional basis for involvement in almost any serious investigation that occurs there, regardless of whether foul play is ultimately established. Federal involvement in a case like this is not, by itself, evidence that federal agents have concluded a crime occurred. It can just as easily reflect the reality that a small county sheriff's department, working a case that has become a matter of national attention, is drawing on federal digital forensics resources it doesn't have in-house, recovering deleted data, verifying video metadata, building precise timelines out of dozens of witness accounts. What has been confirmed is that FBI digital forensic support is assisting with the examination of Nolan's phone, along with other digital evidence collected in the case, and that Jackson County investigators have interviewed roughly 60 witnesses to date, with more expected as the case continues. Digital forensics experts who've spoken publicly about cases like this one have explained, in general terms, what that kind of federal support actually looks like in practice. A phone protected by a passcode limits what a casual observer can see, but it does not erase the underlying activity log. Deleting a photo, a message, or an app doesn't necessarily destroy it. On an iPhone, deleted material can often sit recoverable in an internal trash log for roughly 30 days before it's permanently purged. On Android devices, that window can be considerably shorter, sometimes just a few days. Powering a device off, unlocking it, or interacting with its screen all leave their own internal timestamps, regardless of whether a passcode is in place. A full forensic acquisition, the kind FBI digital forensics teams are equipped to perform, can typically distinguish between content that was never there in the first place, content that was soft deleted and briefly recoverable, and content that was permanently and deliberately destroyed, along with a timestamp for when that deletion occurred. That's the level of detail the joint phone examination both sides have agreed to is expected to eventually produce, which is exactly why so much weight has been placed on that single piece of evidence. As to the grand jury, again, this is a standard procedural step for unnatural or suspicious deaths in this jurisdiction, and prosecutors retain full discretion over whether and when to actually present evidence. Legal analysts who discuss this case publicly have noted that if charges do eventually emerge from a grand jury process, they could take many different forms depending on what the evidence shows. anything from a homicide-related charge to something far narrower like obstruction or evidence tampering, connected not to how Nolan died, but to how the aftermath was handled. At this stage, none of that has been determined, and it would be irresponsible to present any of it as a foregone conclusion. It's worth spending a little more time on the joint phone inspection specifically, because legal analysts who reviewed this case publicly have flagged it as one of the most consequential procedural decisions made so far, arguably more significant in terms of what could eventually prove than either autopsy report. Ordinarily, digital evidence in a death investigation is extracted and analyzed exclusively by law enforcement, with the results shared with family only after the fact, if at all, and often only through the filter of an eventual court proceeding. The agreement reached here, both the family's independent digital forensics experts and the state's investigators viewing the same extraction from the same device at the same time, is, by multiple legal analysts' own description, highly unusual. It typically only happens when trust between a family and an investigating agency has broken down significantly enough that a joint process becomes the only way to ensure both sides have confidence in whatever the evidence ultimately shows. There is a legitimate legal question worth raising here, and to their credit, several attorneys who discussed this case publicly have raised it themselves. Does having multiple parties present during a forensic extraction create any risk to the integrity of that evidence? In the event this case eventually reaches a courtroom, the honest answer, according to those same analysts, is that it depends heavily on execution. A joint extraction conducted properly, with law enforcement's own forensic examiner performing the actual technical extraction, while all parties simply observe the same output simultaneously, does not inherently compromise a chain of custody. What it does do is remove the ability of either side to later claim the other side saw something different, withheld something, or interpreted an ambiguous result unfairly. If anything, several analysts have suggested that a properly documented joint inspection could end up strengthening a future case rather than weakening it, precisely because it eliminates an entire category of dispute before it can arise. What we can tell you as of this recording is that the mechanics of that joint inspection have been agreed to but not yet completed, and its findings have not been made public in any form. Whatever it eventually shows, deleted content, ordinary usage consistent of the friend group's account, or something else entirely, it is very likely to become one of the single most important pieces of evidence in this entire case, specifically because both sides agreed in advance that whatever it shows will have been seen by everyone at once. No case we've covered on this channel has generated more misinformation this quickly than this one, and because so much of it has already caused real harm to real people, we think it's worth walking through clearly what's been confirmed and what's been retracted. Early in the public phase of this case, a photo began circulating online, allegedly showing Nolan at a pool party after the date he was reported to have gone missing, fueling a theory that he had, in fact, survived Horn Island and died somewhere else entirely. That photo spread to hundreds of thousands of viewers within hours and was reposted with an explicit caveat that its authenticity was unconfirmed by attorney Ben Crump himself, whose stated purpose was to generate leads, not to certify the claim as true. Independent reporting, including photo metadata verification published by Rolling Stone and corroborated through a second independent source, later established that the photograph was taken 8 days before Nolan disappeared. Not after. A friend who was close to Nolan and part of the same friend group publicly identified the date and the people in the photo, and has said the resulting theory was, in his words, unbelievable and heartbreaking to watch spread. That theory has been retracted by the outlets and individuals who investigated it. It should not circulate any further, and we're not going to lend it any more oxygen here. A second piece of viral evidence involved a video, recorded from a boat near Horn Island, capturing Ray's voices in what sounded like a confrontation. Crump initially told national media he believed one of the voices belonged to Nolan, demanding a phone back from someone. The individual who was actually in that video later came forward publicly on the record with ABC News and stated clearly that the voice was his own, that he had been in a separate, unrelated altercation with someone else that day, and that Nolan was not present in that recording at all. Crump has since publicly acknowledged his correction, stated that his team is being more careful going forward to frame witness accounts as accounts rather than a confirmed fact, and said that audio analysts are continuing to work to definitively identify who is speaking in that clip. We're including both of these corrections not to relitigate them, but because they matter for the same reason the rest of this case matters. A family looking for the truth about their son does not benefit from strangers online inventing a version of events that isn't real. Every time a false claim like this gets corrected, it should actually reduce the temperature around this case, not get treated as one more item on a pile of suspicious details. There's a broader pattern worth naming here, because it hasn't been unique to those two pieces of viral content. Multiple established news outlets have separately reported on just how much fabricated material has filled the silence in this case, while everyone waits on official results, including, according to Crump's own team, artificial intelligence-generated video falsely depicting Christine Wansley herself, circulating online while she was simultaneously trying to plan her son's funeral. Crump has said plainly, and we'd echo it here without hesitation, that nobody's life should be threatened in the pursuit of the truth, and nobody should be presumed guilty before actual evidence exists, a standard that has to apply equally to every person connected to this case, regardless of which side of the online debate happens to be citing them at any given moment. If you take nothing else away from this section of the video, take this. The gap between an emotional public and a slow, careful forensic and legal process is exactly where fabricated claims spread fastest, because that gap is uncomfortable, and a confident-sounding rumor is a lot more satisfying to sit with an honest we don't know yet. Every rumor that later turns out to be false doesn't just waste everyone's attention. It makes the real findings, whenever they finally arrive, that much harder for people to trust. And it's the family who pays the price for that erosion of trust, not the anonymous accounts who spread the claim in the first place. Setting aside both the retracted photo and the misidentified voice entirely, there is still a real, documented list of details in this case that have not been explained. And we want to be just as clear about those, because pretending they don't exist would be its own kind of dishonesty. There is a documented conflict in accounts of Nolan's final conversation on the island. According to a public statement from the family of the young woman Nolan spoke with that afternoon, she recalls him saying he intended to head back to the boat he arrived on. The friend group's account, given to reporters and, they say, to investigators, is that Nolan told him the opposite, that he wanted to stay behind and continue talking with her. Both accounts have been given in good faith by people who were present. They simply do not match, and as of this recording, nobody outside the investigation has resolved which version is accurate, if either fully is. There is a matter of the phone itself, left behind, according to friends, as a matter of routine, to protect it from salt water, alongside roughly 15 other devices. Nolan's mother has said that when she eventually reviewed the phone, she found no saved photos or Snapchat activity from that day, despite her son's well-documented habit of constantly photographing and posting during gatherings. One friend has offered an alternative, non-nefarious explanation. That cell service on Horn Island is notoriously unreliable, and that Snapchat in particular fails to upload content without a signal, meaning any photos Nolan took that day might simply exist unposted in his camera roll rather than having been deleted at all. Both explanations remain possible. Neither has been definitively confirmed through the forensic phone analysis that both sides have now agreed to conduct jointly. There is a roughly 90-minute gap in the boat's GPS timeline between leaving Horn Island and returning to its original dock, a stretch of time some observers have flagged as longer than a direct trip should reasonably take, though it's also consistent with a boat that was, by the friend group's own account, actively taking on water and being towed part of the way. Investigators have not publicly offered an explanation either confirming or dismissing that concern, and there is a 72-hour incident report deadline that, as of this recording, still has not been met, a documented failure that exists independent of anyone's theory about what happened to Nolan on that island. There's also the matter of communication breakdowns that, while not evidence of anything sinister on our own, help explain why this family's trust in the process has eroded so significantly. Christine Wansley has said that the only contact she received directly from the sheriff's department in the more than 2 weeks following her son's death was a single return text message, one she initiated herself. She has also said she later learned, during the July 15th meeting with the district attorney, that responsibility for communicating with the family had quietly shifted to the district attorney's office and its victim advocate, without anyone informing her that handoff had occurred. That is a kind of administrative gap that happens between agencies more often than most people realize. But when it happens to a family already living inside a national news story, the silence reads very differently than a routine internal handoff. To her credit, District Attorney McElrath reportedly acknowledged the miscommunication directly to the family once it came up, and committed to clearer lines of contact going forward. These are the threads worth continuing to watch. Not because any one of them proves wrongdoing, but because each one represents a specific, answerable question that the ongoing investigation, the phone analysis, the toxicology results, the completed state autopsy, the grand jury process, is now positioned to actually resolve. It's also worth naming, honestly, what would actually take for any criminal charge to emerge from this case, because that's a detail that gets skipped over constantly in favor of speculation. Legal analysts who've spoken publicly about this case have been consistent on one point. A cover-up, if one existed, and a homicide are two entirely different legal questions, requiring entirely different kinds of evidence. Prosecutors do not need to prove that anyone caused Nolan's death in order to bring charges related to how the aftermath was handled. Obstruction, evidence tampering, or a false statement to law enforcement are all, in theory, chargeable independent of the actual cause of death, if the evidence supports them. A homicide charge, on the other hand, requires prosecutors to establish that a specific person's actions caused Nolan's death, a far higher bar, and one that, as of this recording, no released evidence in this case is met. Both of those legal tracks remain technically on the table. Neither has been resolved. Anyone telling you with certainty which one this case is headed toward is telling you something nobody outside the investigation currently knows. One more section to go before we close this update out. The part of this story that actually matters most, and the part almost nobody else covering this case seems to want to sit with. Before we get there, if you made it this far, you clearly care about getting these details right, which honestly makes you exactly the kind of viewer we'd love to have in our subscriber base instead of just our view count. We say this every video because it's true every video. More of you are watching than are subscribed, and that gap is the one thing standing between us and being able to promise you consistent coverage on this case going forward. So, if you haven't yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. Thank you for that. Now, let's bring this back to Nolan. It would be incomplete to cover this case without acknowledging something plainly. The Nolan Wells story has become, for a significant portion of the public, a story about race, not just a story about a drowning under unclear circumstances. That didn't happen by accident, and it's worth explaining honestly, from both directions, rather than picking a side and pretending the other one doesn't exist. On July 22nd, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People held a press conference on Nolan's behalf at its national convention, with NAACP President Derek Johnson, Attorney Ben Crump, and Nolan's parents all speaking. Johnson's core argument, stated directly, was that this case should be judged by the same standard as any other, a full, transparent, evidence-based investigation, regardless of who is involved or what community they come from. He and Crump both pointed specifically to the sheriff's early statement that no foul play was suspected, issued, they noted, less than an hour after the body was recovered and before a full autopsy or toxicology results existed, as the moment that damaged the family's trust in the process from the very beginning. Crump has drawn public comparisons between this case and 2 other recent cases involving young black men who died under circumstances their own families have called insufficiently investigated, arguing that a documented pattern of early dismissal deserves scrutiny in its own right, separate from what ultimately turns out to be true about any single case. On the other side of the same public conversation, other commentators, including some who are black themselves, and including members of the friend group present that day, have pushed back hard on the idea that this case should be read primarily through a racial lens at all, arguing that doing so risks treating a group of teenagers as guilty by association before any evidence has actually been presented against them. Warren Hudson, one of the young men who was part of the larger group on Horn Island that day, has specifically declined, in a public interview, to characterize what happened as racially motivated, saying he didn't feel comfortable speculating in that direction. Sheriff Ledbetter's office, for its part, has maintained that its investigation is being conducted the same way any unnatural death investigation would be conducted in Jackson County, and that the grand jury referral now in motion is standard procedure for exactly this kind of case, not a response to public pressure of any particular kind. We're not going to tell you which of those framings is correct, because it isn't our job to decide that for you, and frankly, neither perspective is something a forensic report or a GPS log can settle on its own. What we can tell you is what's actually documented. The sheriff's office did issue an early statement ruling out foul play before the investigation was complete. That statement has since been walked back in tone, if not in substance. A national civil rights organization is now formally involved in advocating for family, and no evidence has been publicly released connecting anyone's actions that day to race in any confirmed way. All four of those things are true at the same time, and holding all four of them at once, without collapsing into one simple story, is the most honest way to sit with this part of the case. Before we lay out exactly where this case currently stands, it's worth explaining why the toxicology results specifically carry so much weight, because that's a piece of the puzzle that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as the occipital finding or the missing neck structures, despite arguably being just as important. Toxicology testing determines what substances, if any, were present in a person's system at the time of death, and at what concentration. In a case like this one, a young man last seen at a holiday gathering where, by multiple accounts, alcohol was present in significant quantities. That information matters enormously for understanding what actually happened once he entered the water. Alcohol impairs coordination, judgment, and swimming ability in ways that are well documented and medically uncontroversial. It can turn a strong, capable swimmer into someone who struggles in conditions he would ordinarily have handled without difficulty. Establishing whether and how much alcohol or any other substance was in Nolan's system at the time of his death is not a step toward blaming him for what happened. It's a step toward understanding the actual physical circumstances of how a documented swimmer and athlete ended up unable to make it back to shore. That result, more than almost any other piece of evidence still pending in this case, has a potential to meaningfully narrow the range of what likely happened that afternoon. And it still hasn't been released. As of this recording, here is exactly where the Nolan Wells case stands, stripped of speculation. The state of Mississippi's official autopsy has been completed but not released, pending toxicology results that officials say could still take weeks. The independent Family Commission autopsy has produced a preliminary finding of undetermined cause and manner of death, with several specific outstanding questions a pathologist says must still be answered. Nolan's phone is set to undergo a joint forensic examination by both the family's experts and law enforcement, with both sides viewing the extracted data simultaneously. The FBI is providing digital forensic support to a county-led investigation that has, to date, involved interviews with roughly 60 witnesses. A grand jury referral has been confirmed as the next procedural step once the sheriff's office investigation concludes, though no charges of any kind have been filed against anyone, and prosecutors retain full discretion over what, if anything, is ultimately presented. No person, not a single named individual, has been charged with a crime in connection with Nolan Wells' death. Every friend, every witness, every person who was on that island on July 4th remains, under the law and under any standard of basic fairness, exactly what they were before any of this. People who have not been accused of anything, and who are entitled to the presumption that they haven't done anything wrong until actual evidence says otherwise. That includes the young men who were with Nolan that day, and it includes Katie, the young woman whose name has been dragged into national headlines for nothing more than being the last confirmed person to speak with him. Several people connected to this case have already received documented death threats over a photo and a video that both turned out to be misidentified. whatever this investigation ultimately determines. That's a genuinely dangerous outcome that helps absolutely nobody, least of all the family looking for the truth. One friend who was part of the group that day, Trayston Shepard, has spoken publicly more than once specifically to correct the record, clarifying that the voice in the viral confrontation video was his own, not Nolan's, and confirming the timeline of when he last saw Nolan on the island. He has said plainly that he and the rest of the friend group have received death threats since Nolan's body was found, and that he still doesn't fully understand the level of hostility directed at people who, by his account, love Nolan, and are grieving him just as genuinely as anyone else in this story. He has also said something worth repeating here in full, because it captures the tone this entire case deserves better than almost anything else said publicly about it, that he wants people to let the investigation continue, let the facts be shown, and let Nolan be remembered for now simply as the sweet guy his friends knew him to be. That's not a defense of anyone, and it's not an accusation of anyone either. It's a reminder that the people closest to this story, the family who lost him and the friends who were with him, are the ones who have to live inside this case long after the news cycle moves on to something else. If you watch this far, you already know we don't do the rapid-fire, 10 theories a minute style coverage some other channels use for cases like this. We'd rather take 45 minutes and get it right than take 5 minutes and get it wrong. That approach only works long-term if enough of you decide to actually subscribe instead of just watching once and moving on. And right now our numbers show a lot more the second than the first. So if this has been useful to you, go ahead and tap subscribe before we close out. It's the simplest way to make sure you're here for the next verified update on this case. Because this case has unfolded across so many separate developments, here is a complete confirmed timeline in one place, stripped of commentary, exactly as it has been reported and verified. July 4th, morning, a large group of friends, including Nolan Wells, depart for Horn Island across 3 separate boats, arriving at the island by approximately 11:14 a.m. July 4th. Afternoon, Nolan is last seen by his friends around 3 p.m. on the island's northwest tip, having met a young woman identified publicly as Katie. July 4th, late afternoon, the boat carrying part of the group experiences a bilge pump failure. A call for help is placed. The boat departs Horn Island at approximately 4:31 p.m. without Nolan aboard, according to the friend group's account. July 4th evening, the boat returns to the original dock, makes an additional stop at Fort Bayou, returns to the dock again, and is ultimately towed by trailer to its owner's residence in Biloxi that night. July 4th, approximately 11 p.m., one of Nolan's friends contact the Coast Guard. Christine Wansley reports Nolan missing to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office the same night, and later locates his phone at a friend's residence using the Life 360 app. July 5th, a formal multi-agency search begins involving the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and the United Cajun Navy. July 6th, a National Park Service ranger recovers Nolan's body in the water off Horn Island's northwestern tip. He is identified through dental records. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office issues a statement indicating no evidence of foul play at that time. Following days, the state of Mississippi performs an official autopsy. The family retains attorney Ben Crump and arranges for an independent, second autopsy to be conducted in Washington, D.C. July 15th. Nolan's parents meet directly with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath for the first time. Crump announces the case will be referred to a grand jury once the sheriff's investigation concludes, and that Nolan's phone will undergo a joint forensic examination by both the family's experts and law enforcement. July 19th. Dr. Roger Mitchell's preliminary independent autopsy findings are publicly released at an NAACP press conference, classifying both cause and manner of death as undetermined pending investigation, and disclosing the occipital tissue finding along with the absence of the anterior neck structures. July 20th. Nolan is laid to rest at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with a celebration of life following at the Jackson County Fairgrounds. As of this recording, the state's toxicology results remain pending. The joint phone examination has been agreed to, but its findings have not been publicly released. The FBI continues providing digital forensic support to the county-led investigation. No charges have been filed against any individual. That is everything that has actually been confirmed, laid out in order, without a single theory attached to it. Everything else, every viral photo, every disputed conversation, every online allegation, sits outside that confirmed record and belongs there until it's proven otherwise. Equals 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 part 11. Returning to Nolan equals 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 equals. It is easy, in a case like this one, to get pulled entirely into mechanics of it. The GPS timestamps, the forensic terminology, the jurisdictional questions about who has authority over what. All of it matters. None of it is the point. The point is a father who says he still expects, some mornings, to get a text with 3 or 4 videos in it. His son running a route, making a block, asking what he thought. The point is a mother who says the hardest part isn't the grief itself, but the not knowing, layered on top of the grief, day after day. The point is an 18-year-old who, 3 weeks ago, was getting ready to go back to football practice, who made his mother laugh, who never met a stranger, who shared salmon with his mother the night before the trip, the last dinner they ever had together, the night before an ordinary goodbye that turned out to be the last one. Think about how many parts of this case ultimately trace back to something achingly ordinary. A group of friends heading out on the water for the holiday, the way people who grew up on that coastline have done for generations. A teenager staying behind to keep talking to someone he'd just met, the way teenagers do at every gathering, every summer, everywhere. A phone left on a boat dashed to keep it dry. The same casual habit that probably protected 100 other phones that same afternoon without incident. None of those choices on their own were unusual. None of them on their own would ever have made the news. It is only the outcome. An 18-year-old who never came home. That turned a string of completely normal decisions into a case examined sentence by strangers around the country. 3 weeks later. That's worth remembering the next time a piece of the story feels suspicious on its face. Ordinary choices can look sinister in hindsight. One's tragedy has already happened, and everyone is searching backward for the moment that explains it. Sometimes that search finds something real. Sometimes it doesn't. The only way to know the difference in this case, or in any case like it, is to let the actual evidence, the toxicology, the completed autopsy, the forensic phone data, answer question, instead of letting the loudest theory online answer it first. Whatever the toxicology results eventually show, whatever the state's autopsy eventually confirms, whatever a grand jury eventually decides or doesn't decide to do with the evidence in front of it, none of that changes what was already true before any of us ever heard his name. A young man who had his whole life still ahead of him went out on the water with his friends on a summer holiday, and he never came home. His family deserves the actual truth about what happened to him, built patiently on real evidence, not the fastest theory that happened to go viral first. We're going to keep following this case exactly the way we have from the start, reporting what's confirmed as confirmed, what's alleged is alleged, and telling you clearly which is which every single time. When the toxicology results land, when the state's autopsy is released, when the joint phone examination produces something, or when this case reaches a grand jury, we'll be back with the next update, built the same careful way this one was. If you have information relevant to this case, it belongs with investigators, not in the comment section. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has publicly asked anyone with photos, video, or first-hand knowledge from Horn Island on July 4th to come forward directly to them. A brief note on our sources for this video. Because transparency about where information comes from matters just as much in a script like this one as it does in the investigation itself. The confirmed timeline and forensic findings referenced here are drawn from preliminary independent autopsy report as read publicly by attorney Ben Crump and covered by multiple national outlets, official statements from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, GPS records obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources through public records requests and reported by CBS News, audio obtained by NBC News through a records request, and on-the-record interviews given to ABC News, Rolling Stone, and other outlets by individuals present on Horn Island that day. Claims attributed to family members, friends, or attorneys are identified as such throughout, and nothing in the script should be read as an independent confirmation of any claim beyond what its stated source actually established. We'll say it one more time, because it's the entire point of this video. This case is not resolved. It may not be resolved for weeks, possibly longer. The toxicology results are still pending. The state's completed autopsy has not been released. The joint phone examination has been agreed to, but its findings are not yet public. A grand jury has not yet convened. Anyone telling you with confidence, right now, exactly what happened to Nolan Wells on Horn Island is telling you something they cannot actually know. We'd rather tell you what we know, clearly labeled, and let the rest remain exactly what is unanswered for now. There is one more thing worth saying before we close, and it has nothing to do with autopsies, GPS logs, or grand juries. 3 weeks ago, nobody outside of Ocean Springs, Mississippi had any reason to know Nolan Wells' name. Now his face has been on national television. His funeral was attended by public figures most families never meet, and his death has become part of a conversation happening far beyond anything he or his parents ever asked to be part of. That's the strange, uncomfortable machinery a case like this one gets pulled into, attention arriving not because a family sought it out, but because the alternative, silence, felt like it might mean never getting the truth at all. It's worth remembering that every one of those decisions, hiring an attorney, commissioning a second autopsy, standing in front of national cameras, opening a funeral to the press, was made by two parents who, 3 weeks ago, were simply expecting their son to come home from a boat trip with his friends. Nobody prepares for the version of parenthood that requires becoming your own investigator, your own advocate, your own spokesperson, in the span of a single week. Christine and Elmore Wansley did that anyway, not because they wanted the spotlight, but because they didn't see another way to make sure their son's death actually got the scrutiny it deserved. Whatever this investigation ultimately determines, an accident compounded by circumstances nobody could prevent it, or something that required the kind of scrutiny this family has spent 3 weeks demanding, Nolan Wells was a person before any of this happened to him. Not a case number, not a piece of a national debate, a senior receiver getting ready for his first season of college football, a kid who filmed himself running routes to send to his dad, a son who hugged his mother goodbye the night before a holiday weekend and told her he loved her, the way he probably had 100 times before without either of them thinking twice about it. That's who this case is actually about. Everything else, every forensic term, every disputed timeline, every online theory we spent this entire video sorting through, exists only because that ordinary goodbye turned out to be the last one his family ever got.